So far in this lesson, we've discussed some of the elements of poetry, or some of the terms that you can use to analyze a poem. And I've asked you to use some of the general tips that I gave you about poetic terms and about how to read a poem, to read this poem, Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. So what I'm going to do in this short, maybe 7 or 8 minute long lesson is just go through the poem to look at some specific things before you go on to analyze it in a quiz, and before you go on to analyze it in a discussion board with your classmates. What I want to look at specifically is one of the terms that we talked about, and that's imagery. Before we talk about imagery, we're going to go through the poem and stanza by stanza and look at the images or the pictures that the poet's creating for us in each stanza. Before that, I just wanted to draw your attention to the title quickly. So the title is Introduction to Poetry by Billy Collins. And Introduction to Poetry suggests that this poem itself will work as an introduction to poetry, but it's also similar to a course title. So a college course title might be called Introduction to Poetry. A course that someone takes on their own just to learn more about poetry might be called Introduction to Poetry. A textbook that you pick up to learn a little bit about poetry might be called Introduction to Poetry. So I'd like to go with this idea of this being the title of a class. And then we can think about the speaker and who he's speaking to when we look at that first stanza and on throughout the poem. So we're going to look at this first stanza, stanza number 1, before we look at all the others. Okay, so the first stanza is here. And in the first stanza, the poet says, I ask them to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide. So if we've decided that this might be the title of a course, then the I, the poet, the speaker, is likely a teacher, and then we can assume that the them is probably students. So this is a teacher who's asked his students to take a poem and hold it up to the light like a color slide. So it's similar to what this person is doing here with an actual color slide. So if this person had seen this color slide just sitting on a table and tried to look at it, she wouldn't be able to see all that's going on in the slide. She has to take a second step and hold the slide up to the light to really examine it. So holding it up to the light is what's going to allow her to see what's going on. So if you have a poem in front of you and you're trying to figure out what's going on, you're going to have to hold it up to a light. You're going to have to look into it to try to figure out what's going on, just like this person has to do. So this teacher's asking his students to do that with poems. So the first step, really look at a poem, is what he's asking them to do. So then we've got the second very short stanza here. And in the second very short stanza, whereas in this stanza he was asking us to really hold it up and look at it, in this stanza, press an ear against a hive. So if you press your ear up against something, you're going to be able to hear it really well. So here he's urging us to really listen, urging students to really listen and hear what's going on in a poem. And it's important that he uses this word hive here, because hive suggests a really specific thing. A hive is a really busy place. If you held your ear up against a hive, you'd hear a lot of buzzing, a lot of different buzzing sounds, and that's just like a poem. If you really listen to a poem, you're going to hear a lot of sounds, a lot of different sounds going on, and thinking about the effects of the sounds, which is something I encouraged you to do in the little lesson with some tips about reading poetry. So this teacher also is encouraging his students to take a poem and press it up against their ear and really listen to it. So then this next stanza. So we've already been asked to really take a poem and hold it up to a light to look at it, to press an ear up against it and really listen to it, and now we're here. I say drop a mouse into a poem and watch him probe his way out. Okay, so now we're kind of talking about like a physical exploration of the poem. And in this stanza, the physical exploration is just drop right in and feel your way around, like drop right in and probe your way out. So you might be lost. You're not going to, the first time you were in a maze, the first time a mouse is dropped into a maze, the mouse isn't going to find her way out right away. It's going to take some looking around the first time. Same thing with the poem. The first time you read a poem, you can drop right into it and then try to find your way out. So the poets asked us to really look at a poem, really listen, drop right in and find our way out. And now he's also encouraging us, or walk inside the poem's room. So now we're entering the space of the poem and feel the walls for a light switch. Okay. So when you first walk inside an unfamiliar place, you may have trouble finding your way around. So what you might be doing is feeling around the walls until you can find a light switch, turn that light switch on and lighten it. And until then, you have to rely on your other senses and maybe the way you feel. So since poems also look at things besides meaning, they look at tone and they look at mood, this is another thing that this teacher poet is asking us to do. Get in there and feel around until that light switch goes on. Now we get to something that's a little bit fun that the poet's asking them to do. So he says, I want them to water ski across the surface of a poem, waving at the author's name on the shore. So water skiing's fun. The surface of a poem, he's not saying dig deep, dive deep. He doesn't say dive into a poem, dive under. We're sort of just skimming the surface of a poem to see what's going on. And I mentioned this, that you're not always reading for the exact meaning of a poem. It's important to find meaning, but it's also important not to get so lost in meaning that you miss all the other things. It'd be like if every time I listened to a song, I only listened to it for the lyrics and I ignored all the other things like the beat or the fact that maybe it would make a person want to dance or the fact that the music was really sad and might contribute to the mood. So skimming the surface of a poem. Water skiing is just skimming right along on the surface like this person here is doing. And then he wants them, in this last line, to do something else, waving at the author's name on the shore. So there are a few important things going on that are created here. So waving would mean you're pretty confident, right? If you're water skiing and you're skimming along and you're comfortable enough to take one hand off like this here and give a wave and smile, what you're doing there is you have some confidence. You're not going to fall off the water ski. You're skimming along. You're doing okay. So there's some confidence now. We know some things about how to read a poem. We feel a little bit more comfortable skimming along. And the author, it's not even waving at the author on the shore. It's waving at the author's name, sort of way back here, right? Way back here in the poem we have the author's name. So the author's name is important, but maybe we're not supposed to get so caught up in the author or exactly what he means or who he is. Maybe what we're trying to just really do is just kind of acknowledge, hey, here's your poem, you wrote it, not get too caught up in it. And then we get to the last two stanzas, and we're going to look at these together. He's asked his students to do all these things. Take a poem and really look at it. Oops, the arrow's going the wrong way there. Take a poem and really look at it. Really listen to it. Probe your way around, look around. Have some fun skimming it. Be confident. But it turns out, all they want to do, even though he's told them to do all these things here, all they want to do is tie the poem to a chair with rope and torture a confession out of it. So while he wants his students to have fun, to explore poetry, to look at some of the sound, to listen to some of the sounds, to look at some of the images, to feel their way around, to explore, what they end up doing is just tying a poem to and torturing a confession. So we're not sure yet what kind of confession these students want, but we might have an idea when we think about the way we went to school. Okay? So then the last stanza says, they begin beating it with a hose to find out what it really means. So even though he's asked his students to do all these things, what they turn out to do once they get a poem in front of them is tying it to a chair, torturing it and beating it until they can get the meaning out of it. So they ignore all the other things. They're really looking at it in the light. They're really listening to the sounds, dropping in, finding their way around, feeling okay being lost, gaining some confidence, having some fun, and they just concentrate on meaning. And while it's important to find truth and meaning, we all want truth and meaning out of our lives and out of the world, we also have to remember that the process along the way is just as important as finding the truth and not beating the truth out of everything and forgetting to have fun with it.